Regarding the Associated Press today, the Taliban swept into Afghanistan's capital Sunday after the government collapsed and the embattled president joined an exodus of his fellow citizens and foreigners, signaling the end of a costly two-decade U.S. campaign to remake the country. Heavily armed Taliban fighters fanned out across the capital and several entered Kabul's abandoned presidential palace. Suhail Saladin, a Taliban spokesman and negotiator, told the Associated Press that the militants would hold talks in the coming days aimed at forming an open, inclusive Islamic government. Earlier, Taliban officials said the group would announce from the palace the restoration of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the formal name of the country under Taliban rule, before the militants were ousted by U.S.-led forces in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, which were orchestrated by al-Qaeda while it being sheltered by the Taliban. But the plan appeared to be on hold. Kabul was gripped by panic. Helicopters raced overhead throughout the day to evacuate personnel from the U.S. Embassy. Smoke rose from the compound as staff destroyed important documents and the American flag was lowered. Several other Western missions also prepared to pull their people out. Fearful that the Taliban could reimpose the kind of brutal rule that all but eliminated women's rights, Afghans rushed to leave the country, lining up at cash machines to withdraw their life savings. The desperately poor, who had left homes in the countryside for the presumed safety of the capital, remained in parks and open spaces throughout the city. Though the Taliban had promised a peaceful transition, the U.S. Embassy suspended operations and warned Americans late in the day to shelter in place and not to try to get to the airport. Many people watched in disbelief as helicopters landed in the U.S. Embassy compound to take diplomats to a new outpost at the airport. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken rejected comparisons to the U.S. pullout from Vietnam, suggesting that this is manifestly not Saigon. He said on ABC's This Week. The American ambassador was among those evacuated, officials said. He was asking to return to the embassy, but it was not clear if he would be allowed to do so. The officials spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss ongoing operations. As the insurgents closed in, President Ashraf Ghani flew out of the country. The former president of Afghanistan left the country, leaving it in a difficult situation, said Abdullah, the head of the Afghan National Reconciliation Council and a longtime rival of Ghani. God should hold him accountable. Ghani later posted on Facebook that he left to avert bloodshed in the capital without saying where he had gone. And as night fell, Taliban fighters deployed across Kabul, taking over abandoned police posts and pledging to maintain law and order during the transition. Residents reported looting in parts of the city, including in the upscale diplomatic district, and messages circulating on social media advised people to stay inside and lock their gates. In a stunning rout, the Taliban seized nearly all of Afghanistan in just over a week, despite the billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars spent by the U.S. and NATO over nearly 20 years to build up the Afghan security forces. Just days earlier, an American military assessment estimated that the capital would not come under insurgent pressure for a month. For years, the U.S. sought an exit from Afghanistan. Then President Donald Trump signed a deal with the Taliban in February of 2020 that limited direct military action against the insurgents. That allowed the fighters to gather strength and move quickly to seize key areas where President Biden announced his plans to withdraw all American forces by the end of the month. Remained unclear when that transfer place would take and who among the Taliban were negotiating. The negotiations on the government side included former President Hamid Karzai, leader of the Hizb ut-Islami political and paramilitary group, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and Abdallah, who has been a vocal critic of Ghani. Karzai himself appeared in a video posted online, his three young daughters around him, saying he remained in Kabul. Quote, "We are trying to solve the issue of Afghanistan with the Taliban leadership peacefully," end quote. The Taliban earlier insisted that their fighters would not enter people's homes or interference with businesses, and said they will offer amnesty to those who work with the Afghan government on foreign forces. But there have been reports of revenge killings and other brutal tactics in the area of the country the Taliban have seized in recent days. Reports of gunfire at the airport raise a specter of more violence. One female journalist, weeping, sent voice messages to colleagues after armed men entered her apartment building and banged on the door. An Afghan university student described feeling betrayed as she watched the evacuation of the U.S. Embassy. Aisha Quran said, "You failed the younger generation of Afghanistan, hoping to build the country with their own hands. They put blood, efforts, and sweat into whatever we had now." Sunday began with the Taliban seizing Jalalabad, the last major city besides the capital not in their hands. Afghan officials said the militants also took the capitals of Maidan Wardak, Khost, Kapisa, and Parwan provinces, as well as the country's last government-held border post. So in the next couple of days and weeks, we're going to be hearing much about the Taliban. Back in 2001, when the US military invaded Afghanistan, we knew not much about the Taliban back then, or even in the previous years prior to that. And of course, the years between 2002 to 2020. The Taliban have not been really an area of interest for the legacy media, even though that they love to vilify the Taliban as a ultra-Orthodox terrorist sect. That depends on who you ask. Taliban are a repressive Hanafi belief organization, which was a construct of Pakistan and the ISI. So I'm going to try and give you a generalized account about the Taliban and how it began. And I will do this without prejudice or bias and just report on the facts. And we could start with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And a lot of this information I'm going to reiterate to you came from History Commons, generalized news reports from Al Jazeera, Associated Press, Reuters, and Wikipedia. I'm only going to select the information that is generally known or publicly known and not an opinion-based piece. With the entry of Soviet forces in Afghanistan in December of 1979, prompted its Cold War rivals, the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and China, to support rebels fighting against the Soviet-backed Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. In contrast to the secular and socialist government, which controlled the cities, religiously motivated Mujahideen Afghans held sway in the majority of the countryside. And most of the people in Afghanistan, these Mujahideen fighters, were basically farmers, Pashtuns, who were similarly oppressed by socialist, communist-backed leaderships led by Mohammad Taraki, Haifazullah Amin, later Mohammad Taraki, Barbak Karmal. The CIA worked with the Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence Agency, or the ISI, to funnel foreign support for Mujahideen. The war also attracted Arab volunteers known as Afghan Arabs, which included a young Saudi by the name of Osama bin Laden. Most of the Afghan warlords, such as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, Ahmad Shah Massoud, Jalaluddin Haqqani, as well as a number of others. These were the largest groups in Afghanistan, the largest warlords. And much of the millions and billions of dollars went through the hands of these people, which had a trickle-down effect and probably found its way to the very small percentage of Afghan Arabs. Afghan Arabs consisted of maybe 10% of the fighting force in Afghanistan, but most of the nationalist Afghans were being killed. And in replace of them were these Arabs, foreign Arabs, who were coming out of the madrasas of Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and Pakistan, mainly Peshawar and Islamabad. After the withdrawal of the Soviet military from Afghanistan in May of 1989, the PDPA, which are the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, I'm going to keep it short and call them the PDPA regime, under Mohammad Najibullah, held on until 1992, when the dissolution of the Soviet Union deprived the regime of aid, and the defection of Uzbek General Abdul Rashid Dostum cleared the approach to Kabul, with the political stage cleared of socialists, the warlords, some of them Islamists, who vied for power. Shortly after 1986, if I were to return a little bit before then, Juladdin Haqqani became a direct asset of the CIA. And this is according to author of Steve Cole. The CIA is already supporting other Mujahideen leaders at this time, paying cash to the ISI, which in turn gives money to the leaders. But Haqqani is a rare case of the CIA working as an Afghan leader without going through the CIA. But at the same time, the ISI also heavily supports and funds Haqqani. And at the same time, Osama bin Laden and other Arabs fighting in Afghanistan are based in territory controlled by Haqqani. There was only one true Arab base, which was called Al-Masada. Al-Masada was the only base where they trained Arabs. And this was basically just a training base for Arabs to train Afghanis in small arms combat. Afghanis were excellent fighters, in fact, more so than Arabs, but these special group of Arabs headed by bin Laden from the Al-Masada camp were ferocious fighters, and they were willing to die for their beliefs, something that the Afghans, their beliefs are totally different from Arabs. Afghans are basically the Taliban, and of course, Afghanis are led by the Hanafi school of thought, whereas these Arabs, led by bin Laden, are dedicated to the core tenets of Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, or Wahhabism. Bin Laden would later call Haqqani a hero and one of the foremost leaders of the jihad against the Soviets, and Cole would later write that Haqqani traveled frequently to Peshawar to meet with the Pakistani and separately with an American intelligence officer, and to pick up supplies. Bin Laden would have no reason to know about Haqqani's opportunistic work with the CIA, while he and his Arab volunteers benefited from it. They stood apart from the CIA's cash-laden tradecraft, but just barely. And it is not known how long the relationship between the CIA and Haqqani had lasted. In April of 1987, General Hamid Gul was made head of the Pakistan ISI. Gul is a favorite of the CIA station chief Milt Bearden and U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan Arnie Rafael, who view him as an ally and a potential national leader of Pakistan. According to Bearden, however, he will turn against the United States. And evidence will later appear that in the late 1990s, Gul is somehow able to give the Taliban advance warning of U.S. attempts to assassinate bin Laden with missile strikes starting in 1999. To fast forward a little bit, in 1992, the Mujahideen commander, Burhanuddin Rabbani, officially became president of the Islamic State of Afghanistan, but he had to battle other warlords for control of Kabul. And in late 1994, Rabbani's defense minister, Ahmad Shah Massoud, defeated Hekmatyar in Kabul and ended the ongoing bombardment of the capital. Massoud tried to initiate a nationwide political process with the goal of national consolidation. Other warlords, including Ismail Khan in the west and Datsum in the north maintained their fiefdoms. In 1994, Muhammad Omar, otherwise known as Mullah Omar, a Mujahideen member who taught at a Pakistani madrasa, returned to Kandahar and formed the Taliban movement. His followers were religious students known as the Talib, and they sought to end warlorddom through stricter adherence to Sharia. By November of 1994, the Taliban had captured all of Kandahar province, and they declared the government's offer to join in the coalition movement and marched on Kabul in 1995. The Taliban's early victories in 1994 were followed by a series of costly defeats. Pakistan provided strong support to the Taliban. Analysts such as Amin Saikal described the group as developing into a proxy force for Pakistan's regional interests, which the Taliban denied. Some say that the Pakistan's creation of the Taliban was to keep future elements such as communism, socialism, and India away from controlling the country. The Taliban started shelling Kabul in early 1995, but were driven back by Massoud. Now, the Taliban in 1995, while just starting to take over Afghanistan, forms an important alliance with a powerful mafia of truck transporters based in Quetta, Pakistan, and Kandahar, Afghanistan. The transporters pay hefty fees to the Taliban, who in return suppress any local warlords who interfere with the mafia's trade. Additionally, the Taliban ensures that roads are kept open so that the transporters can operate freely. Taliban expert and author Ahmed Rashid argues that the alliance between the Taliban and the Quetta Mafia becomes so successful that it ultimately destabilizes not only Afghanistan, but Pakistan as well. In October of 1995, oil company Unocal signed an $8 billion deal with Turkmenistan to construct two pipelines, one for oil, one for gas, as part of a larger plan for two pipelines intended to transport oil and gas from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan and into Pakistan. Before proceeding further, however, Unocal needs to execute agreements with Pakistan and Afghanistan. Pakistan and Ahmed Shah Massoud's government in Afghanistan, however, have already signed a pipeline deal with an Argentinian company. Henry Kissinger, hired as speaker for a special dinner in New York to announce the Turkmenistan pipeline deal, says the Unocal plan represents a triumph of hope over experience. Unocal will later open an office in Kabul weeks after the Taliban capture of the capital in late 1996 and will interact with the Taliban, seeking support for its pipeline until at least December of 1997. On September 27, 1996, the Taliban, with military support by Pakistan and financial support from Saudi Arabia, seized Kabul and founded the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They imposed their fundamentalist interpretation of Islam in areas under the control, issuing edicts forbidding women to work outside the home, attend school, or to leave their homes unless occupied by a male relative. According to the Pakistan expert Ahmed Rashid, between 94 and 99, an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 Pakistanis trained and fought in Afghanistan on the side of the Taliban. Massoud and Datsum, former arch-enemies, created a united front against the Taliban called the Northern Alliance. In addition to Massoud's Tajik forces and Datsum's Uzbeks, the united front, including Hazara factions and Pashtun forces under the leadership of commanders such as Abdul Haq and Haji Abdul Qadir. Abdul Haq also gathered a number of defecting Pashtun Taliban. Both agreed to work together with the exiled Afghan king Zahir Shah. The Northern Alliance received varying degrees of support from Russia, Iran, Tajikistan, and India. The Taliban captured Mazar-e-Sharif in 1998 and drove Datsum into exile. According to the United Nations, the Taliban, while trying to consolidate power over northern and western Afghanistan, committed systematic massacres against civilians. UN officials stated that there had been 15 massacres between 1996 and 2001. The Taliban especially targeted the Shia Hazaras. In retaliation for the execution of 3,000 Taliban prisoners by Uzbek General Abdul Malik Parwan in 1997, the Taliban executed about 4,000 civilians after taking Mazar-e-Sharif in 1998. Bin Laden's 055 Brigade, which was a guerrilla organization sponsored and trained by Al-Qaeda that had integrated into the Taliban army, were responsible for mass killings of Afghan civilians. The report by the United Nations quotes eyewitnesses in some villages describing Arab fighters carrying long knives used for slitting throats and skinning people. In August of 96, bin Laden was forced to leave the Sudan and arrived in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. He had founded his international Al-Qaeda network in the late 1980s to support the Mujahideen's war against the Soviets, but became disillusioned by infighting among warlords. He grew close to Mullah Omar and moved Al-Qaeda's operations to eastern Afghanistan, a safe haven, as he was under the protection of the Taliban there. However, he was forced out of the Sudan under the pressure of the CIA. The 9/11 Commission in the US found that the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, was able to use Afghanistan as the place to train and indoctrinate fighters, import weapons, coordinate with other jihadis, and plot terrorist actions. However, what's not written in the 9/11 Commission is that the Taliban kept tight wraps under bin Laden. What the Taliban had feared under Mullah Omar, was that bin Laden was an international terrorist. The Taliban were not. The Taliban did not want to expand their borders outside of Afghanistan. Bin Laden wanted to fight the United States and Israel and the coalition partners under the direction of Egyptian radical cleric Ayman al-Zawahiri, who got the idea of the near enemy and far enemy from Muhammad ibn al-Faraj and the Neglected Duty parchment. Faraj created the ideology of the near enemy and the far enemy being America and Israel, the near enemy being secular Arab governments. According to Faraj, his teachings came directly from Sayyid Qutb and Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, or Dr. Fadl, as well as Hassan al-Banna, the creator of the Muslim Brotherhood, in which Faraj had once stated that in order for the Islamic Caliphate to expand, they would need to conquer secular Arab governments and to be led by the Sunnah, the Quran and the Sunnah. After that, when the Islamic Caliphate is created and all the Islamic governments are headed by one Islamic government, the fight would entail the far enemy. However, bin Laden did not want to wait, and under pressure from Ayman al-Zawahiri and Dr. Fadl and the Egyptian radicals, the ideology of the far enemy was the prominent goal. The Taliban had not known about bin Laden or Zawahiri's goal of the far enemy approach. After the August 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings were linked to bin Laden, President Bill Clinton ordered missile strikes on militant training camps in Afghanistan. U.S. officials pressured the Taliban to surrender bin Laden. And in 1999, the international community imposed sanctions on the Taliban, calling for bin Laden to be surrendered. The Taliban repeatedly rebuffed these demands. However, the Taliban High Council met in 1998 and decided that to hand over bin Laden to a Western country were to make the Islamic world look down on the Taliban and consider them munafiq, or fake Arab, or fake Muslims. The Taliban were pressured to keep bin Laden in the country, and in 1999 subjected bin Laden to house arrest in Kandahar with his family and some high-ranking Al-Qaeda members who were living in this encampment. And no Western media were to ever interview him ever again while under Taliban watch. The reports coming out of Afghanistan at this time were basically reports from Afghan independent writers and reporters who were also being killed at this time, whether it was from Taliban or Al-Qaeda or radical factions from Pakistan it is not known, but it is noted that Pakistan did not like reporters at all, especially Western reporters. In a Washington Post op-ed, Zalmay Khalilzad calls on the U.S. to deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Quote, "It is time for the United States to re-engage. The Taliban does not practice the anti-U.S. style of fundamentalism practiced by Saudi Arabia," end quote. He calls on the U.S. to help the Taliban put Afghanistan on a path toward peace, noting that continuing violence has been a source of regional instability and an obstacle to building pipelines to bring Central Asian oil and gas to Pakistan and the world markets. A classified U.S. intelligence report on October 22nd, 1996, concludes that the Pakistan ISI is supplying the Taliban forces with munitions, fuel, and food. The report notes that while the food shipments are taking place openly, the munition convoys depart Pakistan late in the evening hours and are concealed to reveal their true contents. In late 1996, bin Laden establishes and maintains a major role in opium drug trade soon after moving the base of his operations in Afghanistan. Opium money is vital to keeping the Taliban in power and funding bin Laden's al-Qaeda network. One report estimates that the bin Laden takes up 10% of Afghanistan's drug trade by early of 1999. This would give him a yearly income of up to about $1 billion out of 6.5 to 10 billion in annual drug profits from within Afghanistan. At about this same time, the bin Laden family had disavowed of Osama bin Laden and has basically restricted him from the family fortune of the bin Laden, Saudi bin Laden group. Special CIA paramilitary teams enter Afghanistan again in 1997. Gary Schroen, head of the CIA's Pakistan office, will later comment that we had connections to the Northern Alliance, Ahmad Shah Massoud's group of Tajik fighters up in the north. The CIA was sending teams into North Afghanistan from 97 up until about 2000 to meet with Massoud's people to try to get them involved. Around 1999 there will be a push to recruit more agents capable of operating or traveling to Afghanistan, and many locals will be recruited, but apparently none is close to bin Laden. Ahmad Shah Massoud was the only leader of the United Front in Afghanistan in 2001. In the areas under his control, Massoud set up democratic institutions and signed the Women's Rights Declaration. As a consequence, a number of civilians have fled to areas under his control. In total, estimates range up to 1 million people fleeing the Taliban. In late of 2000, Massoud invited some other Afghan tribal leaders to a jirga, which is a traditional assembly of leaders that's supposed to make decisions by consensus and according to the teachings of Pashtun Wali in northern Afghanistan to settle political turmoil in Afghanistan. Among those in attendance were Pashtun nationalists Abdul Haq and Hamid Karzai. In early of 2001, Massoud and several other Afghan leaders addressed the European Parliament in Brussels, asking the international community to provide humanitarian help. The Afghan envoy asserted that the Taliban and al-Qaeda had introduced a very wrong perception of Islam, and that without the support of Pakistan and Osama bin Laden, the Taliban would not be able to sustain their military campaign for another year. Massoud warned that his intelligence had gathered information about an imminent large-scale attack on U.S. soil. But that wasn't all. According to author James Risen, CIA Director George Tenet and other top CIA officials traveled to Saudi Arabia to meet with Saudi Prince Abdullah, the de facto ruler of the country. Tenet wants Abdullah to address the problem of bin Laden. He requests that bin Laden not be given to the U.S. to be put on trial, but that he be given to the Saudis instead. Abdullah agrees, as long as it can be a secret arrangement. Tenet sends a memo to National Security Advisor Sandy Berger, recommending that the CIA allow the Saudis to essentially bribe the Taliban to turn him over. Around the same time, Tenet cancels the CIA's own operation to get bin Laden. That same month, Rich Fowler, the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, tells Berger to let the Saudis take the lead against bin Laden. And in May of 1998, Prince Turki Al Faisal, the head of Saudi intelligence, goes to Afghanistan in late June, to make a secret deal, though with whom he meets and what is agreed on is highly disputed. But it becomes clear after the failed U.S. missile attack on bin Laden in August of 98, the Taliban had no intentions of turning over bin Laden over to anyone. Risen later comments, by then, the CIA's capture plan was dead, and the CIA had no other serious alternatives in the works. It is possible that the Crown Prince's offer of assistance simply provided Tenet and other top CIA officials an easy way out of covert action plan that they had come to believe represented too far big of a gamble. The operation to grab bin Laden in 1997 to 98, a CIA-owned aircraft, which was stationed in a nearby country, ready to land on a remote landing strip long enough to pick him up. However, problems with having to hold bin Laden too long in Afghanistan make the operation unlikely. The plan morphs into using a team of Afghan informants to kidnap bin Laden from his heavily defended Tarnak Farm complex. Michael Scheuer, head of the CIA's bin Laden unit, calls the plan the perfect operation. Gary Schroen, the lead CIA officer in the field, gives it about a 40% chance of succeeding. But the deal did not fall through with the Taliban. On September 9, 2001, two French-speaking Algerians posing as journalists kill Massoud in a suicide attack in the Takhara province of Afghanistan. The two perpetrators were later alleged to be members of Al-Qaeda. They were interviewing Massoud before detonating a bomb hidden in their video camera. Both of the alleged Al-Qaeda men were subsequently killed by Massoud's guards. Massoud lost his life en route to a helicopter to a hospital across the border in Tajikistan. His native Panjshir Valley was attended by the thousands. Immediately after that, the Taliban would begin to control most of the territory owned by Massoud in northern Afghanistan. September 11, 2001. The Taliban publicly condemns the September 11th attacks. U.S. President George W. Bush issued an ultimatum to the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden. Close immediately every terrorist training camp, hand over every terrorist and their supporters, and give the United States full access to terrorist training camps for inspection. The Taliban demanded evidence that bin Laden was involved with the attacks. And the Taliban refused. Bush declared the Taliban a terrorist entity immediately thereafter. Another reason for the refusal of handing over bin Laden was that the Taliban stated he was protected by the traditional Pashtun laws of hospitality, which is the traditional lifestyle of the Pashtun people, in which scholars widely have interpreted as the way of the Afghans or the code of life. Pashtunwali is widely practiced by Pashtuns in the Pashtunian regions of Afghanistan and northern Baluchistan. Although many scholars have portrayed Pashtunwali as stemming solely from the tenets of Islam, the code dates back to the ancient pre-Islamic times. After the U.S. invasion, the Taliban, refusing to hand over bin Laden, instead expressed willingness to hand him over to a third country that would never come under the pressure of the United States if further evidence of guilt were produced. The United States responded by continuing their bombardment of Kabul airport and other cities. For their part, Al-Qaeda threatened further attacks against the UK and the United States. Haj Abdul Kabir, the third most powerful figure in the ruling Taliban regime, told reporters, quote, "If the Taliban is given evidence that Osama bin Laden is involved, we would be ready to hand him over to a third country," end quote. From then on, the Taliban were fighting the U.S. for control of the country. Mullah Omar went into exile and hid in a very secluded area. However, the irony is that Mullah Omar had actually lived in Karachi, Pakistan, until his death. But this claim was contradicted by Betty Dam, a journalist, who wrote that Omar, ironically, continued living in Afghanistan near a U.S. military base in Zabul. Mullah Omar died on April 23, 2013, of tuberculosis. His death was kept secret by the Taliban for 2 years until it was revealed in July of 2015 by the Afghan's National Directorate of Security. The Taliban today continued, the Taliban before today had continued to make advancements in Afghanistan. Under the Trump administration, many bombings were taking place by U.S. drones, which was a continuation under the Obama presidency. In 2021 of this year, the U.S. reached its largest troop level of 2,500 personnel in Afghanistan, which was the lowest force level since 2001. President Ashraf Ghani confirmed that his government was prepared to take forward peaceful talks with the Taliban and address lawmakers. He said it was to hold discussions around new elections and forming a government through a democratic process. During the same month, Germany had decided to send more troops into the country, boosting their forces to 1,300. On April 13th of 2021, President Biden announced the withdrawal of all remaining troops in Afghanistan by September 11, 2021. However, the date was later set for August 31. But in hindsight, we know that is not true. In early March of 2021, Almar district fell to Taliban and government forces withdrew from a base in Bala Mughrib district in the Baghdad province. The Taliban continued to make improvements in capturing cities in all of May and June. And as of now, with the capture of Kabul, the Taliban are now in control of the country. The question is whether they will continue to be a primary force in the country unabated, and whether Afghanistan will now rule under the Quran and the Sunnah as proclaimed by Mullah Omar in 2001. And their wish to not expand past the borders of Afghanistan. What will be the response of the U.S. military in the future? I don't know. Over $2 trillion are wasted. Many billions probably soar in the hands of corrupt warlords like Datsam, maybe even Ghani, the former president, who basically fled the country in cowardice today, leaving the presidential powers to fall into the hands of the Taliban, in which the Taliban had named its own president, the leader of Afghanistan. The response from the United States will probably come from the lobbyists, the military industrial complex, Israel, Saudi Arabia, two of the major foreign lobbyists in the country. We saw many people die, as the United States has a habit of conducting war and destabilizing countries without a plan. We saw this in Iraq twice, Libya, and currently in Syria, in which a war that is continually being fought between Assad loyalists and the Soviet Union, Turkey, US coalition, and Salafi forces. Afghanistan now has to deal with the Taliban and the people there who spent the last 20 years, many good people, will now be under the power of the Taliban. What will happen to these people? Well, if history is of any evidence, many of these people loyal to the government led by Ghani will initially be protected because the world is watching. But when the cameras are off, many of these people will be slaughtered. This is not a protection of the Taliban, nor is this a condemnation. I do not agree with their political and religious ideologies. However, the point is clear. Pakistan, through funding of Saudi Arabia, created the Taliban. Who are the United States allies? Saudi Arabia, and to an extent, Pakistan. To end this war on terror, we must disassociate from terrorism and terrorism-related countries. I'm not talking about Libya. I'm not talking about Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm talking about the Gulf, Saudi Arabia. I'm talking about getting rid of these repressive nationalist regimes like Israel. And of course, the imperialist nation, the United States, led by its corrupt White House, corrupt intelligence agencies like the CIA, its corrupt neoconservative imperialists from the left and right. Imperialism is not strictly defined as conservative. In terms of foreign policy, both the left and right, in terms of imperialism, both the left and right agree, because they are led by private military contracting firms and their contracts, which make hundreds of billions. And what I'm asking for is a pipe dream, because the American people are too divided and fractured to do anything about it, much less protest about this. And so I will end with the hope that the Taliban will not conduct massacres upon the Afghani people who are left behind without hope from their Afghan National Army, in which billions were wasted on them. 20 years of nation building, which was a farce by the United States. There was no plan. There was only one plan, and that is Orwell's quote, that war was not meant to be ended. It is meant to be continuous.